Frank was very intellectual, and so we studied the deeper doctrine of the Watchtower. As a teenager, rather than enjoying novels, I would spend my time reading books such as Babylon the Great Has Fallen, God's Kingdom Rules. They were different times back then. Now, most followers have very little more than a superficial knowledge of Watchtower doctrine.
Jehovah's Witnesses are taught to see Bethel as the spiritual center of the organization. It is supposed to be a place filled with mature Christians working in unity under Jehovah's direction. For many young witnesses, receiving an invitation to Bethel feels like entering the closest thing to paradise available before Armageddon. Paul Grundy believed that image. He did not enter Bethel as an angry critic or a rebellious outsider. He entered as a regular pioneer who had devoted his youth to the organization. He hoped that living among the most spiritual witnesses in Australia would remove his doubts and finally make his faith unbreakable. But according to Paul, the closer he came to the center of the organization, the more human it appeared. Behind the beautiful grounds, morning worship, polished publications, and language of spiritual privilege, he began to see rigid control, personal hypocrisy, and decisions that he could no longer explain as the work of Holy Spirit. Years later, that same Bethelite would create JWfacts, one of the most influential websites ever produced about Jehovah's Witness history and doctrine. So what happened inside the Australian Bethel branch? What transformed a loyal pioneer into a determined investigator of the Watchtower? And why did Paul remain connected to the religion for almost 10 years after his confidence had already begun to collapse? In this video, we will follow that transformation, including the incident that changed Paul's understanding of spiritual appointments, the fear that prevented him from leaving, the research that eventually broke the organization's psychological hold over him, and the personal price he paid when the elders discovered his identity. If you value carefully documented stories about Jehovah's Witness history and the people who saw the organization from the inside, subscribe to Kingdom Wisdom and leave a like. It helps us continue producing videos about subjects that many former witnesses understand personally, but that are rarely discussed openly. Because Paul Grundy's story is not simply about a man who changed his religion. It is about what can happen when an organization teaches someone to search for truth, but then places strict limits on where that search is allowed to go. Growing up, expecting Armageddon, Paul Grundy was raised as a Jehovah's Witness in Hobart, Tasmania. His parents were sincere believers, and several members of his extended family were witnesses. After Paul left home, his father reportedly spent approximately 20 years serving as a circuit overseer, while his sister and her husband also spent time at Bethel. The organization was not simply a religion his family attended. It shaped their friendships, priorities, language, and understanding of the future. Like many witness children of his generation, Paul grew up believing that the present system was almost finished. He did not expect to grow old and believed Armageddon might arrive before he even completed school. But Paul did finish school, and the end did not come. Unusually for a witness family during the 1980s, his parents allowed and encouraged him to attend university. Because higher education was viewed with suspicion in many congregations, Paul balanced his studies with regular pioneering. He could obtain a degree while demonstrating that spiritual activity remained his priority. Paul was not preparing to leave the religion. He was preaching regularly and trying to become the kind of spiritual man the organization praised. Yet one uncomfortable question was already developing in his mind. He met Jehovah's Witnesses who behaved badly, while some of the so-called worldly people he knew were kind, decent, and sincere. How could God destroy good people simply because they did not belong to the correct organization while saving witnesses whose behavior was sometimes worse? That question did not immediately destroy Paul's faith. Witnesses are trained to separate the imperfections of individuals from the supposed perfection of Jehovah's organization. A bad witness was simply an imperfect person. A poor decision by an elder was a human mistake. A changed doctrine was evidence that the light was becoming brighter. The organization itself remained protected from the implications of almost every failure. Paul continued believing that beneath those human imperfections, there had to be evidence of divine direction. If that evidence existed anywhere, he expected to find it at Bethel. Entering the center of the organization, in 1990, Paul moved with his parents to Sydney. Their congregation was located close to the Australian branch headquarters in Ingleburn, allowing him to meet several Bethelites personally. Serving at Bethel began to feel like a realistic goal. Paul had struggled with doubts and repeatedly prayed for stronger faith. He believed that living at the center of the organization might transform him into the spiritual man Jehovah expected him to become. After completing university, he continued pioneering, worked part-time as a cleaner, and applied to Bethel. He received his acceptance letter quickly and entered the Australian branch at the beginning of 1991. He was in his early 20s, had completed university, had served as a regular pioneer, and was prepared to place his future in the organization's hands. Daily life inside Bethel, however, did not match the image he had carried in his mind. Instead of spending his days studying the Bible or performing obviously spiritual work, Paul was assigned to cleaning. The problem was not simply that he had to clean. Bethelites were taught that every assignment was sacred service. The deeper problem was the enormous difference between the spiritual image of Bethel and the reality of institutional labor. Paul began to see Bethel less as a miraculous spiritual center and more as a factory organized around schedules, supervision, hierarchy, and production. People who had spent many hours preaching to qualify for Bethel could find themselves doing fewer spiritual activities after arriving because most of their time was consumed by physical work. Inside Bethel, ordinary workplace decisions also carried religious weight. A Bethelite was not simply disagreeing with a supervisor. He might feel that he was resisting an arrangement approved by Jehovah. This gave managers and institutional rules a level of psychological power that an ordinary employer would not possess. Paul did not fit comfortably into that environment. He was sociable, expressive, and what he later described as a non-conformist. He preferred colorful shirts at a time when white shirts were the unofficial standard for brothers. Small differences attracted attention because conformity was often treated as evidence of spirituality. Eventually, one of Paul's supervisors told him that he did not appear suited to Bethel and asked whether he would consider leaving. Paul already suspected Bethel was not right for him, but leaving under those circumstances would feel like failure. He wanted the decision to be his, so he insisted on staying. He was transferred from cleaning to washing dishes, partly so that he could be supervised more closely. The kitchen eventually became a better assignment for him. Paul enjoyed speaking with people and was made a waiter and later head waiter. This allowed him to meet visitors and prominent members of the organization, including traveling members of the governing body. But the closer he came to the people behind the organization, the less mysterious Bethel became. The men treated as spiritual celebrities were still ordinary human beings with preferences, personalities, strengths, and weaknesses. Paul was beginning to see the human machinery operating behind the spiritual language. When the outside world appeared, more compassionate, Paul also began noticing that people outside the organization sometimes behaved with more reason and compassion than the spiritual men inside it. On one occasion, he needed to help prepare a district convention. Paul asked a Bethel supervisor if he could start work 2 hours earlier and leave 2 hours earlier. He was not attempting to avoid his Bethel assignment. He wanted to adjust the schedule so that he could perform additional work connected to the convention. The request was refused. What disturbed Paul was that a non-witness employer had previously been more accommodating when he needed time to attend a convention. Watchtower publications regularly portrayed the world as selfish, cold, and controlled by Satan. Yet in Paul's experience, a worldly employer had shown more flexibility than a Bethel supervisor. This returned him to the question that had followed him since his youth. If Jehovah's organization was supposed to produce the most loving and spiritually mature environment on earth, why did ordinary people outside it sometimes behave with more kindness? The question became more serious when several of Paul's childhood friends were disfellowshipped or became inactive. He knew witnesses who died by suicide, and one of his close friends attempted to take his own life after being disfellowshipped. Paul understood that he was expected to shun that friend, but he could not bring himself to abandon someone in such a vulnerable condition. He continued contacting him privately from Bethel. Paul was now being forced to choose between organizational obedience and his own sense of compassion. The organization described shunning as loving discipline. Paul saw a suffering friend who desperately needed human contact. The compassionate action and the organizationally approved action no longer appeared to be the same. His doubts were growing, but Paul was still terrified of apostate information. He contacted other religious groups and requested their literature. When those packages began arriving at Bethel, a member of the branch committee spoke with him. Paul was told that he could research other religions, but should be careful and devote most of his attention to Watchtower material. This revealed a fundamental imbalance. Jehovah's Witnesses encouraged people from other religions to examine Watchtower publications, even when their religious leaders warned them not to. But witnesses themselves were discouraged from seriously examining criticism of their own organization. Paul was permitted to look outside, but only through a window controlled by the Watchtower. The appointment that changed everything. The decisive event came in 1994. According to Paul's account, a Bethelite he knew and admired was reappointed as an elder. Shortly afterward, it was discovered that this man had reportedly been involved in adultery for approximately 7 years, including during his time at Bethel. Paul was devastated because he cared about the people involved. But the theological consequences were even greater. Jehovah's Witnesses were taught that elders were appointed under the direction of Holy Spirit. Paul had accepted that claim as evidence that Jehovah was actively guiding the organization. Yet here was a man who, according to the information Paul received, had been living a double life for years and had still been approved as an elder. Paul did not interpret this merely as an imperfect man deceiving other imperfect men. He began questioning the spiritual explanation surrounding the appointment process. If that process could produce the same mistakes expected from an ordinary human institution, what evidence demonstrated that Holy Spirit was directing it? And if the brothers could mistakenly claim spiritual direction when appointing elders, could they also mistakenly claim spiritual direction when interpreting doctrine? To be accurate, this was Paul's conclusion. Jehovah's Witnesses could argue that appointment by Holy Spirit does not mean elders possess supernatural knowledge or that a dishonest candidate cannot conceal wrongdoing. But for Paul, that explanation weakened the original claim. If there was no observable difference between a spirit-directed appointment and an ordinary human mistake, what did spiritual direction actually mean? This was the crack that reached the foundation of his faith. Paul had entered Bethel hoping to find proof that Jehovah guided the organization. Instead, he witnessed an appointment he could no longer reconcile with that belief. But he did not immediately become an outspoken critic. He found himself trapped between belief and disbelief. Paul no longer trusted the organization completely, but he was still afraid that leaving could result in his death at Armageddon. He feared losing his parents, sister, relatives, and almost every friend he had. He feared entering a world he had been trained to view as dangerous. He also feared that his doubts might be the result of pride, sin, or satanic influence. Paul was no longer certain that the Watchtower possessed the truth, but he was still terrified that it might. Leaving Bethel, but remaining trapped. Paul left Bethel in 1994, after approximately 3 years of service. But leaving the branch did not mean leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. It would take almost another decade before he stopped attending meetings. This is critical to understanding his experience. Paul did not discover one contradiction and immediately walk away. Fear kept him connected to an organization he increasingly doubted. After leaving Bethel, Paul began wondering what would happen when the generation associated with 1914 passed away without Armageddon arriving. He could not imagine the Watchtower simply admitting that the expectation had failed. When the interpretation of this generation changed in 1995, he viewed the adjustment as evidence that the leadership would reinterpret the teaching instead of confronting the implications of the earlier expectation. Still, Paul continued attending meetings. This is why the accusation that former witnesses leave because they want to sin fails to explain experiences like his. Paul did not rush toward freedom. For years, he remained connected to a belief system he increasingly questioned because the emotional price of leaving appeared unbearable. By 2004, he was almost inactive. Elders tried to help him return and encouraged him to strengthen his faith through additional study. Ironically, that recommendation helped push Paul toward the research that would finally end his belief. He realized that although he knew Watchtower doctrine and policy extremely well, he had never examined the organization from a genuinely independent perspective. He knew how Watchtower publications answered critics, but he had not carefully investigated what those critics actually said. He knew the organization's version of its history, but he had not compared that version with older publications and outside evidence. Around the time of the Indian Ocean tsunami in December 2004, Paul began researching claims about earthquakes and the last days. The supposed increase in earthquakes had been one of the arguments supporting his faith. When he compared the Watchtower's presentation with broader historical and scientific information, he felt profoundly deceived. One question led to another. What about 1914? What about the changing generation teaching? What about failed expectations, the authority of the governing body, and the belief that only Jehovah's Witnesses would survive Armageddon? Paul became consumed by research. Every discovery created both excitement and fear. He was learning to evaluate information freely, but he had been taught that independent thinking could lead him directly into Satan's hands. Early in 2005, Paul stopped attending meetings and attempted to fade quietly. He hoped to leave without the confrontation and public punishment associated with disfellowshipping. But leaving physically did not remove decades of conditioning. Paul has said that he experienced severe emotional distress, struggled to concentrate, lost his job, and endured 2 extremely difficult years financially. He continued researching partly because he needed to prove to himself that he had not been deceived by apostates or blinded by Satan. The organization was no longer controlling his daily schedule, but its warnings were still active inside his mind. The birth of JWfacts. Out of that research came JWfacts. Paul initially kept his identity hidden. His goal was to organize information about Watchtower history and doctrine in a form that ordinary witnesses and Bible students could understand. He wanted people to have access to both sides before making commitments that could affect their relationships for the rest of their lives. Instead of relying primarily on sensational accusations, JWfacts collected statements from Watchtower publications, organized them by subject, compared teachings from different periods, and documented how official explanations had changed. Readers could examine subjects such as 1914, 607 BCE, blood transfusions, shunning, failed predictions, the governing body, and the organization's history. The site was openly critical and reflected the perspective of a former witness. Paul did not claim to be incapable of error and invited readers to identify mistakes. The power of JWfacts came from directing people back to the organization's own words. A loyal witness could immediately dismiss the accusations of an angry former member. It was more difficult to dismiss a scanned page taken directly from an old Watchtower publication. This is the irony at the center of Paul Grundy's story. The organization taught him to search publications, compare scriptures, and explain religious claims to others. His years as a pioneer trained him to present complicated subjects clearly. His experience at Bethel showed him the human side of the institution. When Paul stopped defending the organization, he used many of the skills it had given him to examine it. Bethel did not teach Paul to become an apostate, but according to him, it provided the experiences that made unquestioning belief impossible. The place he entered to strengthen his loyalty laid the groundwork for a website that would challenge the source of that loyalty. Discovered by the elders. Approximately 6 months after JWfacts went online, local elders discovered that Paul was behind it. They arrived at his home and informed him that he would face allegations of apostasy. Paul attempted to have his baptism annulled. Because he had been baptized as a minor, he argued that a child could not fully understand the lifelong consequences of making a commitment to an organization, especially when leaving could result in the loss of family relationships. The request was rejected, and a judicial committee was formed. Paul came prepared with reasons he no longer accepted Watchtower teachings. According to his account, however, the committee did not meaningfully examine the doctrinal issues he raised. The central question was not whether his evidence was accurate, whether the organization had changed important teachings, or even whether Paul still believed in God. The central question was whether he still accepted the Watchtower Society as Jehovah's organization. That distinction is revealing. If truth were the primary concern, the evidence would have to be examined. If institutional loyalty were the primary concern, discussing the evidence would be unnecessary. The committee only needed to establish whether Paul continued to recognize the organization's authority. Shortly afterward, it was announced that he was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Paul was 36 years old and, according to his account, lost contact with much of the family and social network that had defined his life. ABC Australia later reported that he was ostracized by his family and everyone he knew. The same man who had spent years pioneering and volunteered his youth at Bethel was now someone loyal witnesses were expected to avoid. Paul described the following months as a mixture of freedom and deep trauma. For the first time, he could look at the world without interpreting everything as evidence of Satan's system approaching destruction. But he could not stop thinking about his family or trying to understand how people who loved him could withdraw from his life. Eventually, Paul sought help from a cognitive behavioral therapist. This is the part of leaving that doctrinal debates often fail to capture. A person can discover that a teaching was wrong in a single afternoon. Recovering from the emotional system built around that teaching may take years. JWfacts eventually became one of the most recognized independent resources about Jehovah's Witnesses. Over the years, Paul received messages from readers who said the site helped them understand Watchtower history, evaluate its teachings, or recover from the fear that followed them after leaving. Paul has never presented himself as a heroic figure superior to other former witnesses. He has described feeling humbled and surprised that the website became such an important reference. His contribution was making difficult information accessible to people who were often too frightened to know where to begin. His story also carries a warning for institutions that demand certainty. Paul entered Bethel with questions, but he wanted those questions answered in a way that would preserve his faith. He was not searching for an escape. He was searching for confirmation. Instead, Bethel showed him the human machinery behind the spiritual language. Fear kept him connected to the organization for another decade. Research eventually broke that fear. When the organization responded to his conclusions by removing him instead of seriously examining his evidence, it gave him another reason to document what had happened. This does not mean every person serving at Bethel is hypocritical or secretly losing faith. Many Bethelites are sincere people who believe they are sacrificing their lives for God. Paul entered with that same sincerity. The deeper question concerns a system that can take sincere sacrifice, surround it with institutional control, and punish those who reach conclusions the leadership has not authorized. Paul Grundy walked into Bethel hoping to become a stronger Jehovah's Witness. He walked out uncertain whether the Watchtower possessed the truth. 10 years later, he created a website designed to examine that claim using the organization's own historical record. The Watchtower did not intend to create the man behind JWfacts, but by presenting human decisions as divine direction, discouraging independent examination, and attaching devastating social consequences to disagreement, it helped create the kind of critic it feared most. Not an outsider inventing accusations, but a former insider preserving the organization's own words. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable part of Paul Grundy's story. According to him, he did not lose faith because he remained far away from the organization. He lost faith because he came close enough to see how it actually worked. If you were once one of Jehovah's Witnesses, do you remember the first moment when an organizational decision stopped looking spiritual to you? Was it a doctrinal change, the behavior of an elder, a judicial committee, or something you discovered in an older publication? Share your experience in the comments. Your story may help someone who is still living through the same fear and confusion that Paul experienced for so many years. And subscribe to Kingdom Wisdom for more carefully documented stories about the people who challenge the Watchtower from the inside.